Police brutality beat black man without knowing he is with the president. When two officers forcibly removed a young black man from an airplane, they had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't an ordinary passenger. It was a highly trained Secret Service agent, Agent Daniels. What unfolded next would leave everyone on board stunned. Agent Daniels had just settled into his seat on a commercial flight, his expression calm, his mind focused. Dressed in plain clothes to remain inconspicuous, Daniels was on a covert assignment to protect a high-ranking official, the president himself, who was set to board the plane shortly. Though his outward demeanor was neutral, his senses were sharp, carefully scanning his surroundings for anything unusual. Seated a few rows behind Daniels, Officers Carter and Blake, both in uniform, entered the plane and began assessing the cabin. Their eyes landed on Daniels, and their curiosity quickly turned into suspicion. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Officers Carter and Blake approached Agent Daniels. They had received an anonymous tip about a potential security threat on board, and to them, Daniels fit the vague description provided. His calm demeanor and focused gaze, ironically, only heightened their suspicions. "Sir, we need you to come with us," Officer Carter said firmly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Agent Daniels looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. He had dealt with situations like this before, misjudgments based on appearances, but this was no time for misunderstandings. The president's safety depended on his ability to remain on the flight. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Daniels replied evenly. "I'm here on official business." Unconvinced, Officer Blake leaned in. "We're not asking, sir. Stand up and come with us, or we'll have to remove you by force." Daniels sighed, his hand moving slowly to retrieve his identification from his jacket. But before he could show his credentials, the officers interpreted the motion as threatening. "Hands where we can see them," Carter barked, reaching for his baton. The situation escalated rapidly. Despite Daniels calmly stating, "I'm with the Secret Service," the officers refused to listen. Passengers looked on in shock as the two men forcibly grabbed Daniels, pulling him from his seat. It wasn't until Daniels was on his feet, his badge falling from his pocket and gleaming on the floor, that the realization struck. Several passengers gasped, and the flight attendants froze in place. As the realization settled in, a hushed tension filled the cabin. The badge lying on the floor bore the unmistakable emblem of the Secret Service, the words etched into the metal as clear as day. Officer Blake picked it up, his face paling as he read the credentials aloud. "Agent Nathan Daniels, Secret Service." Daniels adjusted his suit, his expression a mix of irritation and urgency. "Now that you understand who I am," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we don't have time for this. There's a credible threat, and every second we waste increases the risk to lives, including yours." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "A threat? What kind of threat?" Carter asked, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. Daniels leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "There's a suspected terrorist on this flight. We've been tracking them for weeks, and intel suggests this is their target. I'm here to neutralize the threat discreetly. Do you understand what that means?" Blake swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the badge. "Why weren't we briefed?" "Because this operation is classified," Daniels replied curtly. "Now, I need you to step aside and let me do my job. Unless you want to explain to your superiors why you interfered with a federal investigation." Carter and Blake hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right," Carter said. "What do you need us to do?" Daniels picked up his carry-on bag, unzipping it to reveal a small earpiece and a concealed communication device. "First, I need you to sit back down and act normal. If the suspect sees you acting suspicious, they'll know something's up. Let me take the lead." The officers obeyed, taking their seats near the front of the plane. Daniels, now fully in control, began scanning the cabin subtly. His training kicked in as he analyzed each passenger's behavior. Most were preoccupied with their phones, books, or chatting quietly. But one man near the middle of the plane stood out. He wore a loose jacket despite the warm temperature in the cabin, and his eyes darted around nervously, never lingering on any one thing for too long. Underneath the seat in front of him, Daniel spotted a backpack tucked tightly against his feet. A backpack the man seemed particularly protective of. Daniels tapped his earpiece and whispered, "Suspect identified. Row 14, seat C, confirmed position with ground control." A voice crackled back in his ear. "Confirmed, Agent Daniels. That's our target. Proceed with caution. The next steps would require precision and tact." Daniels couldn't afford to panic the passengers, nor could he allow the suspect to realize he'd been made. He decided to wait for the drink service, a perfect opportunity to get closer without raising suspicion. As the flight attendants made their way down As Daniels moved toward row 14, the cabin seemed to grow quieter, as if the tension radiating from him had settled over the passengers. The suspect, a man in his late 30s with an unkempt beard and a sweat-drenched brow, glanced up and met Daniels' gaze for a split second. It was enough. Daniels saw the flicker of recognition. The suspect knew something was wrong. Daniels maintained his calm, slipping into the empty seat directly behind the man. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but authoritative. "Sir, I need you to remain calm and keep your hands where I can see them. This is a matter of national security." The man froze, his knuckles tightening around the armrest. He didn't look back, but Daniels could see the subtle twitch in his shoulders, a sign of someone weighing their options. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man muttered, his voice shaky. Daniels wasn't buying it. He placed a hand gently on the back of the man's seat, leaning closer. "Let me make this clear. You don't want to do anything foolish. Whatever's in that bag isn't going to help you now." The man shifted uncomfortably, his breathing growing heavier. Daniels glanced toward the front of the plane, where Carter and Blake were positioned, ready to assist. The flight attendant he'd briefed earlier moved through the cabin with practiced ease, keeping passengers distracted with offers of drinks and snacks. But the suspect wasn't going to make this easy. He suddenly stood, yanking the backpack from under his seat. The sudden motion drew startled gasps from nearby passengers. Daniels was on his feet in an instant, his hand gripping the man's wrist like a vice. "Put the bag down. Now." Daniel's voice cut through the commotion like a blade. The man's eyes darted around wildly, his panic palpable. "Stay back," he shouted, clutching the bag tightly against his chest. "I swear, I'll do it." The passengers began murmuring in alarm, some rising from their seats, only to be waved down by the flight attendants. Daniels kept his voice steady, his eyes locked on the suspect. "Listen to me," Daniels said. "Whatever you're planning, it doesn't have to end this way. You're out of options. There's nowhere to go, nowhere to run. Put the bag down, and we can talk." The man shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "You don't understand. They made me do this. If I don't..." He choked on his words, his grip on the bag faltering for a brief moment. Daniels seized the opportunity. In a single fluid motion, he twisted the man's arm and forced him back into his seat, pinning him against the window. Carter and Blake were there in seconds, helping to restrain the suspect as Daniels pried the bag from his grasp. The plane erupted into chaos. Passengers screamed, some crying, others shouting in confusion. Daniels held the bag carefully, his training guiding every move. He placed it on the floor and opened it just enough to confirm his worst fears. Inside was a crude explosive device, wires tangled around a digital timer that was counting down. "Time," Carter asked, his voice tight with urgency. Daniels inspected the timer. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. "Can you disarm it?" Blake asked, sweat dripping down his temple. Daniels didn't answer immediately. He was already reaching into the bag, carefully tracing the wires to determine which ones connected to the detonator. His hands moved with precision, his focus unshakable. "Keep him secured," Daniels said, nodding toward the suspect, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. and keep the passengers calm. I don't need a stampede." The cabin was a cacophony of muffled cries and panicked whispers. The flight attendants did their best to reassure the passengers, their voices trembling as they assured everyone that the situation was under control. Daniels, meanwhile, worked quickly. His earpiece buzzed with updates from the emergency response team, who were coordinating with the flight crew to ensure the plane could land safely. 2 minutes, Carter said, his eyes flicking nervously between the timer and Daniels' hands. Daniels didn't respond. His attention was fixed on a single red wire that seemed to connect to the detonator. His training told him this was the one, but there was no room for error. One wrong move, and the consequences would be catastrophic. 30 seconds, Blake whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. Daniels took a deep breath, steadying his trembling hands. He gripped the wire cutters and positioned them around the red wire. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, and with a swift motion he cut the wire. The timer stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent, the tension so thick it felt as though time itself had paused. Then the collective exhale of relief swept through the plane like a wave. Passengers began clapping, some crying openly as the realization hit them. They were safe. Daniel stood, holding the disarmed device aloft. "It's over," he said, his voice carrying a weight of finality. As the plane began its descent, escorted by fighter jets scrambled to ensure its safe landing, Daniels turned to the suspect, who was now being escorted to the rear of the plane by Carter and Blake. "You made the right choice by surrendering," Daniels said. "Now, tell me everything about the people who made you do this." The suspect hesitated, but then nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his decision. Daniels knew the information he provided could be the key to dismantling a larger network of threats. As the plane landed safely at the nearest secure airport, a sense of cautious relief rippled through the passengers and crew. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, their flashing lights reflecting off the aircraft as it taxied to a secluded area, away from the main terminal. Daniel stood near the cockpit, observing everything with a sharp, analytical eye. Though the immediate danger had been averted, the real work was just beginning. Carter and Blake escorted the subdued suspect down the stairs, handing him over to the waiting authorities. He looked drained, his defiance replaced by the resigned expression of a man who knew there was no escape. Federal agents swarmed the area, their questions rapid and pointed. But Daniels stepped in before they could overwhelm the suspect. "Give him a moment," Daniels ordered. "He's more valuable to us talking than shutting down under pressure." The agent stepped back reluctantly, allowing Daniels to take the lead. He crouched down to meet the suspect's gaze, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're in deep, no question about it," Daniels said. "But this doesn't have to be the end for you. Work with us, and we can help." The suspect hesitated, his lips trembling. "They'll kill me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "You don't know what they're capable of." Daniels leaned closer, his expression softening just enough to convey sincerity. "I do know. That's why we're here, to stop them. But we need your help. Names, locations, plans, whatever you can give us. We'll protect you, but you have to trust me." After a long pause, the suspect nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice cracking. "I'll tell you everything." As the agents whisked the man away for debriefing, Daniels turned his attention back to the disarmed bomb, now secured in a containment unit. A team of bomb technicians had arrived to analyze it, their faces grim as they examined the device. "This wasn't amateur work," one of them said, glancing at Daniels. "Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. We'll need to trace the components to see where they came from." Daniels nodded, already thinking several steps ahead. "Send me the report as soon as you have it. I want to know everything, materials, origin, even the tiniest detail. It could be the lead we need." As the chaos began to subside, Daniels finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. He scanned the crowd of passengers, many of whom were still being comforted by the flight crew. A little girl clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face, while an elderly couple sat silently, their hands intertwined. Daniels felt a pang of guilt. He was trained to handle situations like this, but the civilians caught in the crossfire didn't sign up for this kind of terror. He made a mental note to check in on them later, ensuring they received whatever support they needed. Carter approached, his face a mix of exhaustion and respect. "Hell of a job back there," he said, clapping Daniels on the shoulder. "You kept your cool the whole time." Daniels shook his head. "It's not about me. It's about making sure everyone goes home safe." Blake joined them, holding a tablet displaying a map. "We've got a preliminary lead," he said. "The suspect mentioned a warehouse where the device was assembled. Local authorities are already on it, but they want us to lead the charge." Daniels straightened, his focus sharpening. "Then let's move. We're not done yet." The team regrouped, boarding a waiting transport vehicle that would take them to their next destination. The adrenaline from the plane incident still coursed through their veins, but they knew there was no time to dwell on it. Every second mattered. As the vehicle sped toward the warehouse, Daniels reviewed the data on the tablet, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one plane or one bomb. It was about dismantling an entire operation, a shadowy network that thrived on fear and chaos. "I want eyes on every angle," Daniels said, addressing Carter and Blake. "Drones, ground surveillance, everything. If there's even a hint of movement, I want to know about it." The warehouse came into view, a nondescript structure on the outskirts of town. It looked abandoned, but Daniels knew better. Appearances were often deceiving. As they prepared to breach, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The events on the plane were just the tip of the iceberg, a glimpse into a larger, more dangerous game. The warehouse loomed before them, a silent and foreboding structure nestled among a cluster of industrial buildings. Its exterior appeared nondescript. Yet Daniels knew that in this line of work, such places often concealed far more than they let on. As they arrived, a team of tactical officers in full gear was already assembling, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Daniels scanned the surroundings, his instincts heightened. "We'll approach from all sides," he instructed, his voice cutting through the tension. "Blake, you and Carter take the east perimeter. I'll take the west with the rest of the team. Remember, we're looking for more than just the bomb-making materials. We need to find the people behind this operation. This could be the hub of something bigger." The team nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. Daniels had seen them all work under pressure before, but this felt different. The sense of urgency was palpable, and each of them knew the stakes were higher than ever. As they split up and moved into position, the hairs on the back of Daniels' neck prickled. There was a quiet before the storm, an unsettling stillness that suggested someone or something was waiting. He motioned for the officers to follow, crouching low as they approached the back entrance of the warehouse. Blake and Carter's team had already made it to their designated points, and the perimeter was secure. Daniels checked his watch. No more delays. "On my mark," he whispered, his voice steady but taut with anticipation. He gestured toward the reinforced steel doors. Now, the team moved in swiftly, their movements a blur of precision and training. Daniels took the lead, his hand on his weapon, his senses sharpened to the slightest sound. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and they filed inside, using the shadows to their advantage. The interior was dimly lit, filled with industrial shelving units stacked high with various crates and materials. There was a heavy smell in the air, a mix of chemicals, oil, and rust. The team fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained calm. He knew that if they were lucky, they'd find vital intel here. If not, they might just be walking into a trap. "Clear," Blake called out from the far corner, his voice low but sharp. "All clear on this side," Carter added. Daniels nodded, signaling for the team to advance further into the warehouse. He glanced at the crates, quickly scanning for anything that might indicate the nature of the operation. Some of them were labeled with unmarked symbols. disturbing signs of illicit dealings. Others had codes that hinted at classified operations. His mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. "Keep your eyes peeled," he ordered. "There's more going on here than just bomb-making." As they continued deeper into the warehouse, they came across a hidden door, barely noticeable, tucked behind a stack of metal barrels. Daniels motioned for the team to pause, his instincts telling him this was the critical point. He signaled to Blake to check it out. Blake approached cautiously, his hand on the doorknob. With a swift motion, he twisted it open, revealing a staircase leading down into a dimly lit basement. The air was thick with tension. It felt like the heart of the operation was below, and Daniels was determined to uncover it. The team descended in formation, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. The basement was colder, the walls lined with old, faded storage shelves that seemed untouched for years. But at the far end, a heavy steel door stood out, slightly ajar. "This is it," Daniels whispered, his hand instinctively tightening around his weapon. "Get ready." They approached the door, their movements slow and deliberate. As Daniels pushed it open, the dim light revealed a room full of high-tech equipment. Computers, communication gear, and several large crates marked with the same unmarked symbols they had seen earlier. The place reeked of secrecy. Blake moved toward the computer terminals while Carter checked the crates. Daniels scanned the room, his mind racing. They had to act fast. Suddenly, a voice came from behind them, sharp and clear. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Daniels spun around, his gun raised instinctively. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, dressed in tactical black, his hands raised in surrender. His face was hard to read, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "You must be Daniels," the man said, his voice smooth. "I've heard a lot about you." Daniels' mind clicked into overdrive. This was no ordinary criminal. This was someone with power, someone who wasn't afraid to stand his ground. "I've heard about you too," Daniels replied evenly. "But you're going to talk, or this ends very badly for you." The man's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You really think you can stop this?" "You're already too late." Just then, the team behind Daniels moved in, securing the man with swift precision. But Daniels' attention remained focused. There was something off about the situation. They had found their man. But Daniels could sense this was just a small part of something much larger. "We've got him," Carter confirmed, pulling the man's arms behind his back. Daniels kept his eyes on the criminal. "I hope you're ready to talk," he said, his voice steely, "because you're going to wish you had talked sooner." As the man was escorted out of the room, Blake turned to Daniels. "What do you think? Is this the leader?" Daniels paused, looking around the dark room once more. "No, he's a pawn. The real mastermind is still out there, and we've just scraped the surface." The mission was far from over. What they had uncovered was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and Daniels was determined to put it all together. The stakes were too high to stop now. The interrogation room was cold, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls. Daniels sat across from the man they had apprehended, who was now sitting in a chair, handcuffed but surprisingly calm. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that filled the room, a stark contrast to the tension that gripped Daniels. He had seen this many times before. Criminals who thought they could outwit the system, who believed they could remain silent and walk away unscathed. But Daniels had a way of breaking that silence. "You know," Daniels began, his voice measured and calm, "you're not the first to come through that door. You won't be the last. So, why don't we make this easy?" The man stared back at him, unblinking, his expression unreadable. "I'm not talking. No deal with you." Daniels leaned back slightly, watching him carefully. "You're right. No deals. You're not going anywhere for a long time. But I'm not here to waste time. I've got a team who's already going through your operation, and they're going to find your friends. But let me give you a heads up. The higher-ups are going to be real interested in how you got this far. You might not last long enough for that to matter." The man smirked, though there was a nervous twitch in his eyes. "Do your worst, Daniels. You won't break me." Daniels didn't flinch. He had dealt with people like this before, hardened criminals who thought they were invincible. But what they often failed to realize was that underestimating Daniels was their biggest mistake. He had the patience to let things unfold at his pace. And if the man wasn't going to talk, Daniels had other ways to get what he needed. "I think you'll change your mind," Daniels replied softly. "Because the truth is, you know more than you're letting on. You're not some random operative in a small-time operation. You're part of something much bigger. And when the feds find out what's really going on, they're going to come down hard on you." For the first time, the man's expression faltered. Just a flicker, but it was enough. Daniels leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, persuasive tone. "The only way you walk out of here is if you help us understand the full extent of this operation. Names, locations, everything. Otherwise, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." A long silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, the man's lips parted, his voice low and strained. "You think you're the first to come after us? There's more than you can handle. Much more." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He had expected this. But the man's words confirmed what Daniels had suspected all along. The operation they had just scratched the surface of was much larger than they had anticipated. And now, they had a chance to get to the heart of it. "What do you mean by more?" Daniels pressed, not willing to let the opportunity slip away. The man hesitated, then spoke in a low tone. "The bombings, the weapons, it's just a small piece of what we're doing. The real plan is much bigger. International. The connections go deeper than you can imagine." Daniel's mind raced, taking in the implications of what the man had just revealed. This was no longer just a local threat. The stakes had escalated to a global level. The ramifications of their success or failure in this operation were immense. "We'll see just how deep this goes," Daniels muttered, standing up and signaling for the officer to take the man back. "Your cooperation will decide how much you'll suffer. But know this. What's coming next is bigger than you." As the door clicked shut behind the man, Daniel stood motionless for a moment, allowing the weight of the situation to settle in. He had just received a crucial piece of information, but it was far from enough. The criminal world they were dealing with wasn't just a handful of rogue actors. It was an organized network entrenched deeply in global operations. The man's words echoed in Daniel's mind, an ominous warning that the investigation was far from over. Outside the interrogation room, Blake and Carter waited for Daniels to emerge. They could see the seriousness in his face, and they didn't need to ask what had been revealed. "You got something?" Blake asked quietly. Daniels nodded. "This is bigger than we thought. Much bigger. They've got international connections, a network we didn't know existed. The bombings and weapons were just the beginning." "What's next?" Carter asked. Daniels took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. "We keep digging. We go after every lead, every name, every piece of intel we can find. We're not backing down. Not until we take down the entire operation." The road ahead was uncertain, but Daniels felt a renewed sense of purpose. This operation had just begun, and the mission was far from over. They were fighting a war on multiple fronts, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. But with the new information they had, Daniels knew they were one step closer to dismantling the network behind the bombs. Conclusion: as the investigation progressed, the pieces began to fall into place. With each lead followed, Daniels and his team uncovered more about the network they were up against. A network that spanned across borders, connected with international arms dealers, and was fueled by a well-coordinated criminal agenda. The road was long and dangerous, but Daniels knew that with each victory, they were one step closer to stopping a catastrophe that could have rocked the world. The team's relentless pursuit, their determination to expose the full scope of the operation, paid off. And though the battle was far from over, Daniels knew that the end was in sight. But as he looked toward the horizon, He also knew that every victory came at a cost, and that the fight against the powerful forces they were up against was far from finished.